Welcome to the Voicebox, and it's our second year of doing this, and we've just gone even bigger and better this year. We have 8 incredible guests, so we've broken it down into, it's going to be 3 guests coming up first, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes, and then there'll be a chance for you to ask all 3 questions. So session 1 is about wellness in the workplace and culture. Then our second session is about how to make your career last, mental health breakdown and career burnout avoided, and we've got 2 speakers within that session. And then the final one is the equality emergency with 3 incredible sessions. So stay with us this morning on the Voicebox, and I will be coming to you all for questions after my first 3 guests. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome session number 1 and Kat Agostinho from Imagen Insights. Give a round of applause.
Hi.
Wonderful. Well, I've just been down at the wellness stage with Kay Mundy from Google, and we were talking all about how to put the fire out on burnout. And one of the things that's causing a problem with it is toxic workplaces. We know that they exist, but can we help heal them, or can we try and understand the signs to avoid them? So, Kat, I'm going to ask you first, how can you define a toxic workplace and how these show up?
So sadly, I can define it because I have been in one. And there are a number of things to look out for. Anything from bad leadership, poor communication, lack of growth, progression. In my case, which I'll talk a bit more about, was bullying, cliques, aggression, putting fear into people. There are so many ways that this can show up in an organisation, and unfortunately it sometimes is very hard to spot because they're underlying traits that are happening. They don't necessarily come to the surface, but they can play out over a number of years, over time. And I happened to be a few years ago in a very toxic workplace. I've also worked in some amazing places, but in my case was bullying. And like I said, these things don't always come to the surface. You can't always spot them initially. And it almost broke me, which we'll go on to talk about a little bit more. And hopefully then, if you are going through that, or if you know somebody that is going through that, you can help to spot the signs and hopefully help to overcome those as well.
Well, let's talk about actually, because I think one of the biggest problems is not being able to spot the signs. But before we ask that, I want to say, when it's happening to you, how does it impact your daily life?
It can show up in so many ways. We were listening to Kay speak about it earlier, and she spoke quite a bit about how it can affect your mental health, your physical health, but actually that self-doubt that creeps in. So you start questioning, am I the right person for this job? Am I qualified for this job? Should I even be here? What has my career done to date? And that lack of confidence that you have in yourself can really take over. It can also affect things, and Kay also mentioned things like your sleep and just genuinely your health. And that can then have an impact on your relationships. If you do happen to leave that job, then it can have financial strain. So there's so many ways that it can affect you as a person. And then if you do leave that job, then being worried about, can I get another job somewhere else? How do I interview? Have I got the qualifications? So it can impact you so much that it can really take over your...
Should you go with the idea that if you don't love it, change it? Or is the end result always going to be, fuck it, leave it, and you end up leaving? Or is there another way? Is there a way of changing a toxic work culture?
So I have said that. I have said, if you don't love it, change it and be brave. But it's actually very hard to be brave when you are in that situation. So if, in my case, where I was bullied at work, and I'll just give you a bit of context about what happened. So I went into a company as a senior person. There were a number of junior colleagues that were not happy about me and a couple of others coming into this organisation, and really set out to make our lives very difficult. And this transpired in the way of writing little notes when you were presenting, laughing as you walked past, sending really horrible Slack messages, trying to call you out in front of people. And while it sounds quite childish, it actually, over time, really starts to take its toll on you. And I think I didn't want to admit that this was happening to me. It felt that something like this, at this point in my career, should not be happening. And so I didn't want to believe it. So at that time, I did not feel brave. There was, nothing I could really do to get myself out of that situation because I hadn't spotted the signs and I didn't want to believe it. But and some of the things I've mentioned about the signs that you can spot, if you are not yourself in that situation, but you can see that somebody else is, start to recognise what is happening and really try and pull that person aside and have a conversation with them to ask them, how they're feeling at that time. If I had been brave, and I wish I had, stuck up for myself a little bit more and been more open with it, perhaps I could have prevented the amount of time that it took me to then have to deal with that situation afterwards. And I now speak about this openly and honestly and try and speak about it as much as I can. I don't need to mention names, I don't need to mention the company, but I do that because I hope that other people will then feel that they can talk about it or they can go out and do something. And relying on your network around you, of course, friends and family will be a great support, but being brave enough to speak to somebody in your network, there will always be someone that will want to help you. I get so many messages from people after I've spoken or just that they've known that I'm very open about this topic that say, I've been going through something similar, or I know somebody that's been going through something similar, or actually I can spot that sign. And if I can be there just to listen to somebody, then that will help them. If you can be brave enough, it will help you to build resilience. It will help you to go into that next situation and go, I'm not going to stand for that shit. This shouldn't be happening in workplaces anymore. It just shouldn't be happening. And in my case, while there are incredible leadership teams and HR teams out there, that wasn't the case in this organisation. The leadership team knew what was happening and they didn't want to do anything about it. And the HR team, sadly, were there to support the business and not the individual. So I would urge you, if you can, call out these people and just stop this shit from happening.
And also, I'll absolutely 100% agree with that. And I'm going to add another layer to it, which is if you see it happening to somebody else, call that shit right out. I want to ask, though, for you, Kat, are there any standard red flags to look for? This is a really hard one. In a company before you go there? Or in the initial stages, or red flags? Because obviously you try and choose a company to go to that you think looks good. Are there any red flags that should be a warning sign?
So my first warning sign was that the person that hired me had left before I joined. So that would be one thing, is look at the people that are there, see how long people have been there, try and do a bit of due diligence. There's probably somebody that in your network that knows somebody that works there. Ask them about how the culture is, ask them how they feel, ask them what their experience is at that company. Ego is also, it's fine to have ego, but when people say they don't have an ego, normally means they do have an ego. I would say that's a big red flag. Lack of communication. So if there hasn't been any communication, if you're about to join a company and you haven't had communication about what is to come, and especially about the culture, then that would be a big red flag. But if you are already in that organisation and these things start to happen, some of which I mentioned before, like bad communication or poor leadership or lack of accountability, then they would be huge red flags for me, and that's when I'd start to act upon them.
And my final question, and then we might have time for one question before I then invite our next guest up, and then I'll bring you back in a bit. But if you do, and I mentioned that, if you see it, help. But what else can you do if you see it? How do you solve it?
I think solve is probably hard if you are going through it, but also if you can't solve necessarily somebody else's experience. But as someone, if you are seeing someone going through that, listen. Be there, listen, check in with them. We've talked about it a couple of times today. Really ask how they are feeling in that moment. Is there anything you can do to support them? And if you are going through that situation, I would urge you to talk to somebody else, to try and find an ally within that business or outside that you can have a conversation with and be really open with.
Well said, Kat. I've got time for one question specific to Kat's session on toxic workplace, if anyone has one right now. If not, I'll go to session 2 and we'll just keep this going. Is that okay? Lovely. Kat, take a seat over there, and then we're going to give Kat a round of applause. Thank you very much, Kat Agostinho.